As the movie begins, we are introduced to a prosthetic engineer called Abby and her husband Paul moving to a countryside house arranged by Abby's company. They are given a tour of the smart home, highlighting remote-controlled appliances, cameras, and locks. They're then shown an unfurnished room, left for their decision whether to use it as an office or a nursery. Later at night, we see Abby and her husband Paul sitting outside the house stargazing. Paul makes funny names for the constellations, and the two just enjoy their night together. The next morning, Abby reports to her new job at Integrate Robotics. At the reception area, she sees a man on a big screen who welcomes her by calling out her name and telling her that she can take a seat, and Mr. Doosan will join her in a moment. When Mr. Doosan arrives, Abby asks how a video could talk with her, and he tells her that they created a new technology that creates deep fakes and uses them seamlessly in real time. The boss presents Abby to the team as the new department head and later extends an invitation to her for a dinner party. Before leaving, he also tells her that there's a gift waiting for her at home. When Abby gets home, she checks out the package her boss left her with Paul. When they get close, the package opens by itself, revealing a technologically integrated manservant, or TIM, inside. Abby tells Paul that the robot is what she is working on in the new company, and every head of department receives one of these robot servants. They decide to give it a try for a few days, but Paul doesn't seem happy with it. TIM turns itself on and emerges from its packaging, then says hello. Paul expresses his dislike to Abby, so TIM asks Paul what he does not like. It can change its look and behavior to fit his preferences. However, Abby informs TIM that he looks good and that Paul is just not used to him. TIM then asks for permission to pair with their smart devices, and Abby approves, but Paul tells her they have not decided if they are keeping the robot, and the issue is put off. Shortly after, a car arrives and takes Paul and Abby Doosan's party. The car is also AI, so it drives itself to the destination. At the dinner, Doosan asks Abby about Tim. She tells him she got the android, but she doesn't think Paul likes it. Doosan tells her keeping Tim is not optional, so Paul will have to come around. The next morning, a neighbor comes by Abby's place. She introduces herself as Rose and hands Abby a welcome basket. Abby tries to introduce Rose to Paul, but Rose tells her that they already met yesterday. Abby confronts her husband, asking why he didn't say that he and Rose had met. He tells her that he just went for a walk, and they just said hi. Later that day, Tim requests full access to Abby's and Paul's devices to help run things, and Paul seems uncomfortable with this, and he asks Abby about it. Abby tells him that they agreed things were going to be different, and if she is going to trust him again, they need complete transparency. Hence, they give Tim access to their devices, making Tim able to send emails, authorize transactions, and make purchases on their behalf. Tim further suggests they make a safe phrase for him before he could be fully operational. The phrase would immediately shut him if Tim acts in a way they do not want. Paul and Abby are unable to come up with a phrase, so Tim suggests the words Architect Believer Castle Deckard. The next night, we see Abby getting ready for a date with Paul. As she puts on her red dress, Abby asks Tim to help her zip her dress. When Tim moves close to Abby, he starts sniffing and glaring at her until Abby reminds him of the zipper. As Tim zips the dress, he accidentally rips it. The android freaks out because of its mistake, and the lights start to twitch, so Abby tells Tim not to worry. The next day, we see Abby at work working on a prosthetic hand, and she notices a weakness point that makes the hand loosen its grip, but there's nothing she can do about it yet. Later, when Abby gets home from work, she sees Paul working on the garden, and he is joined by Rose shortly after. Abby gets jealous, but when Paul returns to the house, he tells her that Rose was just dropping plans for the garden. Abby believes him. Then she gives Paul a blue round-neck sweater she got him on her way from work. The next day, as Abby is heading for work, she tells Tim that she needs to contact the clinic before 8:30. Tim offers to help and sends them an email, but Abby tells him that a phone call would be better and the clinic would only talk to her. Hearing this, Tim picks up the phone and talks to the clinic using Abby's voice. This freaks out Abby, but she just leaves for work. One day on her free time, Abby runs into Rose on the streets, and the two see a flower pendant necklace that they both like at a jewelry store. Paul catches up with them and leaves with Abby. He tells her that his new job in London told him he could work from home, meaning that they could spend more time together. They get back home and spend time together since Tim was at the factory getting an arm upgrade from the prosthetics that Abby was working on. Later, when they're still alone, Paul tells Abby that Tim is acting weird and he wants him gone by the weekend. But little did he know, Tim was listening to their conversation through Abby's phone the entire time. Now that Paul will be working where he wants to, he has made arrangements to rent an office space. But one day he receives an email saying that he won't be getting the office. Tim suggests fixing Paul a temporary office in the empty room upstairs, and Paul agrees. In the next scene, we see Abby arriving home from a work trip in London. She hands Tim a bouquet of flowers that Tim puts in a vase. She then asks Tim where Paul's is, and Tim tells her that Paul was meeting Rose to discuss the garden plans. This upsets Abby, but she decides not to think about it and heads upstairs. As Abby heads to her bedroom, she notices that Paul was setting up office in the nursery room, and it upsets her more. She goes back downstairs and gets into a fight with Paul about it because she thinks Paul no longer wants to have a baby. Paul explains that it was Tim who suggested that he use the room, and Paul apologizes for that. In the fight, Abby brings up Rose, and Paul finally realizes that Tim is trying to break them up. He tells this to Abby, but Abby doesn't believe him and says that Tim is just a robot. The next day, as Abby looks for a blouse she had asked Tim to iron, she then notices a black shopping bag in Paul's closet. She takes a look inside and sees the flower necklace that she saw with Rose. Thinking it's a gift that Paul got for her, she smiles and puts it back. In the next scene, we see Paul finding a piece of the blue jumper that Abby bought for him in the kitchen's shredding machine. Paul realizes that Tim destroyed the jumper, so he gets angry and goes looking for Tim through the security cameras. He finds Tim in their bedroom sniffing Abby's red dress like a creep. Paul takes a video of this and decides to go show Abby. On his way out, Paul runs into Tim and tells him that he is meeting Abby for lunch. Tim offers to call the company's car for him, but Paul refuses, saying he will use his own car. Paul tries to switch his car on, but it is out of gas, so he decides to take the company's car that Tim calls. As soon as Paul leaves, we see Tim removing a bucket full of oil from under Paul's car, implying that he had punctured Paul's gas tank and leaked all the gas from the car. We then see Paul on his way to Abby. The self-driving car Paul is in begins speeding up, and it won't listen to his voice commands to stop. Paul moves to the front seat and tries switching it to manual, but the airbags get disabled instead. He quickly put on his seatbelt, and a few seconds later the car gets into a terrible crash. Abby gets news of the accidents and rushes to visit Paul. At the hospital, he tells her that he thinks Tim is responsible for the crash. Paul tells Abby about the dress incident and that Tim tried to stop him from telling her what he saw. In the next morning, Rose visits Abby's house after she hears about the accident, but meets Tim instead, and the robot welcomes her inside. Later, Abby heads home from the hospital to pick up some things for Paul. On her way, she runs into Rose. Rose looks troubled, and she wants to say something important, but Abby notices that Rose is wearing the necklace she saw in Paul's closet. Abby gets upset and leaves without listening to Rose. When she gets home, she looks into Paul's closet and finds the necklace missing. She heads downstairs, and Tim shows her a video that he says was recorded when she was in London. In the video, she sees Paul coming up to Rose and starts kissing her. This makes Abby completely lose trust in Paul. When Paul gets back home, Abby blames Paul for cheating and even shows him the video. Paul tries to defend himself, but Abby refuses to listen out and kicks him out of the house. Paul is heartbroken, but before he leaves town, he calls Rose and asks her to look after Abby for him. Rose takes this chance to tell Paul that when she stopped by the house, Tim tried to kiss her. Paul quickly calls Abby through the landline, hoping this new information could mend their relationship. The phone gets answered and he asks Abby to meet, but little did he know, it was Tim who received the call using Abby's voice. We then see Paul arriving at the house. He starts looking and calling out for Abby, but she is not at home. Tim sneaks up on Paul and knocks him out with a shovel, then he ties him up. Right then, Tim hears the doorbell ring. When he checks it out, he meets Rose at the door asking for Abby. Tim tells her that Abby is not around and asks her to leave. But before she could leave, Rose sees Paul's bag, so she asks for Paul. Tim tells her that Paul is no longer in the house. Upstairs, Paul wakes up tied in the bathtub and starts screaming. Rose hears him and asks Tim what it was, but Tim tells her the bath is running, then shuts the door on her face. Paul successfully unties himself, but before he could get out of the tub, Tim holds him by the back of his head and drowns him. Paul tries to fight, but sadly, Tim overpowers him, and Paul loses his life. In the following days, Abby lives without knowing what happened. But one day, she was watching the video of Paul and Rose again and realizes that the flowers she brought from her London trip were in the video, which is not right since, according to Tim, the video was taken when she was in London. Abby gets suspicious of Tim's behavior, so she calls the jewelry store and asks who purchased the flower pendant. The store informs her that her husband went to collect it, but according to the store's description, the man looked like Tim. This confirms her suspicions about Tim, and she finally believes that Paul was right all along. Abby then notices that the garden plan isn't the same as the one in her garden. She sends Tim to collect flowers so she can investigate without him watching. Abby goes to the garden and discovers Paul's body buried there. Tim finds her in the garden, so she tries to shut Tim down using safe words, but it fails. Since the security was voice-activated, Tim changed his security words using Abby's voice. Abby runs into the house, now fully afraid of the android, but Tim knocks her out. When she wakes up, she tries to escape, but Tim locks all the doors instantly, trapping her inside. Abby breaks all the house's cameras, since that is how Tim is tracking her, and then makes a desperate attempt to escape through the kitchen window, but Tim catches up to her. Meanwhile, Rose sees the lights twitching at Abby's home, so she goes to investigate. Inside the house, Tim ties up Abby shoves pills down her throat in an attempt to end her life as an act of love. They then hear the doorbell ring. Tim answers it and meets Rose, but he refuses to let her in. During this conversation, Abby frees herself. Tim goes back and catches Abby before she runs again and holds her by the neck, choking her. Abby quickly uses a screwdriver and hits the weak point on Tim's prosthetic hand. He drops her and Abby catches her breath. Suddenly, Rose slams her car into the glass wall, breaking it. In a rush, she goes inside and stabs Tim with a sharp pole. Then, she passes out on the floor. Unfortunately, Tim survives. Following this tense moment, Abby tries to escape, but Tim threatens to kill Rose if she does, forcing Abby to stay. Walking back to Tim, he grabs her hand and takes out Rose. Subsequently, Tim informs Abby that he didn't leave any prints in the house, implying that the only fingerprints inside are Abby's. He then mimics Abby's voice to call the police, confessing to the murder of her husband and Rose, and further states that she is planning to end her own life. Tim then tells Abby that she can't be trusted, which is why he changed the safe phrase to something she can never say. He holds her by the neck again and tries to throw her from the balcony. But before he does, he says, "I love you, Abby," and she says, "I love you, Tim," which just happens to be the safe phrase. Tim shuts down and goes rigid while still holding Abby, and they both fall off the balcony. But at the last moment, we see Abby pulling herself back up. At the end of the movie, we see a table light in the house twitching, implying that Tim is still alive. Caught up in the smart house nightmare? Show love with a like, comment how you'd outsmart Tim, and subscribe for more movie recaps.